I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. Well, the situation in Venezuela gets more interesting as each day passes. The new president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who's never been elected to office, she was never elected vice president. She was appointed vice president by the now ousted president of the country, Nicolas Maduro, was kidnapped by U.S. forces violently. They killed about 100 people in the process, brought the guy back to New York to stand trial for violating U.S. drug laws while the guy was over there serving as president of Venezuela. Don't ask me how the president of Venezuela is guilty of violating U.S. drug laws and also U.S. gun laws in Venezuela. This is the empire. But the new president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, she has now called for or decreed amnesty for all the political prisoners in the country. Now, why are there all these political prisoners, which I think number around 700? I think they totaled at least 1,000, probably more. I think she released 300. But now she's announced amnesty for all of them. Well, the reason they were in jail in the first place was because they were protesting against Maduro's stealing of the election, the presidential election. Everybody, most everybody, except Maduro and his regime, concedes that the opposition garnered about 80% of the votes. And the available tallies they had, which were numerous, indicated this was an overwhelming defeat for the Chavista regime, which U.S. officials, as many of you know, has labeled a narco-terrorist regime, a drug-dealing regime. And so they had Maduro under criminal indictment in the U.S., along with the Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello, who's a ruthless guy. I mean, the Ministry of the Interior, this is like a combination of the CIA, the FBI, ICE, the Pentagon. I mean, it's just a ruthless organization that rounds people up on the streets. Any hint that they've been demonstrating or protesting or opposing the Chavista regime, they round them up and put them in jail or even kill them, because their governmental system is much like the United States. They are a national security state, just like the United States is. And their national security establishment wields omnipotent powers over the citizenry, just like here in the United States. And so this guy, interestingly enough, Cabello, is still the Minister of the Interior. And fundamentally, nothing has changed. It's a socialist-communist regime, and it is a narco-terrorist regime. That's not my verbiage. That's the U.S. verbiage. So by removing the president of the country, Maduro, from office and elevating Rodriguez, the regime itself hasn't changed. It'd be like, the president of some country dying or something and the vice president takes over. It's still a socialist communist regime. But it's affecting these changes, like changing the oil industry so that the Trump administration and the national security establishment can seize control over the oil industry and take some of the oil themselves. Because remember, this military machine of the U.S. requires massive amounts of oil every day. And so now they've got access to Venezuela oil because this woman is following orders from Trump. And Trump's saying she's cooperating. It's really funny that, he's just so proud of the fact that he's got this relationship with her, and he's maintaining this regime in power, which is kind of amusing in a way, because this is a socialist communist regime. And the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA have always been anti-communist. That was what the whole Cold War racket was about. The anti-communist crusade, the Reds are coming to get us. And communist Cuba, was a communist dagger pointed at America's neck throughout the Cold War. That was why they were, invading Cuba, pressuring President Kennedy to invade Cuba, trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, committing acts of terrorism that were killing people inside Cuba. Not because Cuba had done anything violent to the United States. Cuba just wanted to be left alone. It was because Cuba had gone socialist-communist. And so imagine the irony. And that war hasn't ended, as we can see now with Venezuela and Cuba. Here's the irony, which is kind of amusing. They're partnering with a Cuban communist regime, a Venezuelan Cuban communist regime, get them mixed up sometimes, in order to now squeeze Cuba for being a socialist communist regime. So they're totally obsessed with Cuba. They have been since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, 1960. I mean, that was what the embargo's been all about, is to impoverish the Cuban people, just like the sanctions against Venezuela, Iran. That's what sanctions do. They target the civilian population with death in the hopes that they'll rise up or deny tax revenues because everybody's so poor to the regime, and then it falls. And that's what they're doing now. They're doing their best to prevent Venezuela from shipping oil to Cuba. And now Mexico, they're pressuring Mexico into stop selling oil with the idea that the regime will fall. Finally, they'll be able to say, oh, after all these decades, our embargo finally worked. But the real thrust of this is creating chaos and crisis among the citizenry, where the citizenry gets so desperately poor, dying of starvation, dying of illness, like they were in Iraq. Same situation was in Iraq, 11 years of sanctions. And when Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was asked whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions was worth it, she said, yeah, it's worth it. And by it was regime change. And so now they're partnering with this Cuban communist regime, Venezuelan Cuban communist regime, Venezuelan socialist communist regime, to try to squeeze the Cuban people with death by starvation, illness, as a way to bring down the communist regime there in Cuba, like denial of any kind of tax revenues or revenues from oil or whatever. That's the objective. So the Venezuelan people have clearly had their fill of this socialism that they've had, along with the U.S. sanctions. The U.S. sanctions have been really probably more destructive than the Venezuelan socialism. But in any event, it's a vice that's just squeezing, and both sides tighten and tighten, because the more the sanctions create chaos, the more socialism, the more government control over the economy. And so in the middle are the Venezuelan people. So it was clear that that dissatisfaction manifested itself clearly in the national elections a couple years ago. And the opposition, which is led by this woman, Maria Corina Machado, smashed the Maduro Chavista regime. And this was by, again, the tallies that were available. It was about an 80% to 20% vote. And Machado would have been the candidate, except the Maduro regime disqualified her, said she was for some reason illegal. She's a criminal if they had her under indictment, which, by the way, shows you that when you hear about that Venezuela's exporting their criminals to us, it really doesn't mean much, because their definition of criminal encompasses people who are opposing the regime, and that's what all these dissidents were. And Machado herself is under criminal indictment, if they have an indictment, as a formal accusation there in Venezuela by the Chavista regime. But she put up somebody else, the opposition put up this guy, I forget his name now. And so, guy's 80 years old or so, and he really won the election, but he had to get out of the country because they were threatening him with incarceration, torture, execution. And so he fled to Spain. She remained there until the time of the Nobel Prize ceremony, and she took off in a clandestine way to go to the Nobel ceremony. But she's clearly the leader of this. Now, again, these protests, these people were put into jail there and tortured because they were protesting. And all you got to do is incarcerate a few people or kill a few people, and always there's going to be people on the margin that say, I don't want to protest anymore. I got children. I don't want to take that chance. I mean, you see that in the United States here. The United States is no different. It's a national security state, killing protesters in Minneapolis, for example. And this is how a national security state operates, whether you're talking about the North Korean national security state, the Cuban one, the Venezuelan one, the Russian one, the Chinese one, or the American one. They're all the same fundamentally. You kill a few protesters, and on the margin, there's going to be some people with families that say, I'm not going to take the chance. And so it's a perfect way to suppress, peaceably assembled demonstrations, protests, free speech. Because you can say, well, we're not doing anything to them anymore. Well, yeah, that's because they're all staying at home, which is what happened in Iran when they killed an estimated 5,000. And they did the same in Venezuela. They rounded up these 1,000 people. And so everybody else just quiets down. And so when Trump removed Maduro, everybody thought that it was going to be a regime change operation where he puts in the legitimate people who won the election, like Machado. She didn't win anything, but the guy that's in Spain, he won. But he didn't do that. Instead, Trump said, we're going to maintain this socialist-communist regime into power because I can work with them and there's stability. And by the stability, he's talking about the national security establishment, their version of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, which is really what wields the power in any national security state. And so he's saying, well, Rodriguez has a good working relationship with the real power of the government, and they work together, and they've worked together for many years, and she and Cabello are going to be remaining into power, and we're going to work with them. It wasn't a formal partnership, but it's working together with this narco-terrorist regime. And now she's under investigation, official investigation by the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. She hasn't been indicted yet by the federal government like they did with Maduro, but they did indict Cabello, who they're working with because it's all part of the regime. It's a narco-terrorist regime. That was the label they put. But they're keeping them in power. And so Machado is saying, well, I'm going to return to Venezuela. I want to return to Venezuela. But how does she do that? And Trump says, well, we might find a place for her, a role for her. Is he kidding? I mean, okay, let's say they make her the minister of economy because she's free market. So she's now the free market minister of. They would kill her in a New York minute. They're not going to let her live. And I'm hoping that she's smart enough to realize that, not to take the bait and accept a position in this narco-terrorist socialist communist regime, even if it is working with President Trump and the U.S. national security establishment. And it's not surprising to me that the U.S. national security establishment is working well with these people because they got the same mindset. Control, killing people, And so you've got this situation where she's declared amnesty. Now, did that come from her? I don't think so. She has not become a civil libertarian overnight, and Cabello would never go along with it. It's because, as Machado has said, she's taking orders from Trump. And she really has no choice, though. I mean, if she doesn't take orders, Trump has this siege around Venezuela where there's no oil being exported. So there's no revenue for the government. They're at any particular point in time just weeks away, if not days away, from mass catastrophe where there's mass starvation. I mean, remember, the sanctions and the socialism caused 8 million Venezuelans to flee, many of whom, as we know, came to the United States. Now, when they got here, hardly anyone said, well, gosh, no wonder that they came here. Look what we're doing to them. Nobody wanted to talk about that the U.S. government was the contributing factor to this. Because even with a socialist dictatorship, people can still survive. There's still economic activity taking place, not a tremendous amount. But the sanctions are the killer. I mean, that's what just, puts the knife right in and twists it. So the 8 million fled. They came here. They were deported back to Venezuela. They were labeled as bad people, tattooed gang members and invaders, and they were deported back to where death awaited them, death by starvation, or deported to El Salvador for torture, indefinite incarceration, even though they've never been convicted of any crime. And the worst thing they ever did was just leave their country because the U.S. was starving them to death with the sanctions, along with the socialism. So after the election, you have these massive protests, and so this regime, very tyrannical regime, it's a national security state regime, starts rounding people up. And so Machado is saying, well, she's just taking orders from Trump, which has got to irritate Trump, because Trump wants to make it look like it's this cooperative endeavor. Well, it's cooperative in the sense that if she doesn't obey his orders, all of a sudden the siege comes back on. And so she wants to stay in power just like any other ruler wants to stay in power. And so she's going along with this. And presumably Cabello is too. But now they're releasing these people. And so she's portraying herself as this big civil libertarian that, new day in Venezuela. And she says Maduro's on board with this. And she's kind of making it look like, this is all coming from her. Well, this is a very combustible situation. Right now it looks stable, and that's what Trump's rationale is that if he keeps this socialist, communist, narco-terrorist regime in place that gets along well with the big power, the national security establishment, that he can maintain stability and get American oil companies in there to extract oil. But like one oil executive said, that is uninvestable. That it's too precarious a situation. To me, it's you've got like embers burning, and it could just burst into flame at any time. And sometimes there's a delayed reaction to these kind of operations. If you take Iran, they had a regime change operation there. The CIA did in 1953. In 1979, you get the Iranian Revolution because of that 1953 coup. That's a long delay. So you never really know what's going on. To judge the operation by the first few weeks or months is sometimes problematic. But here's the thing. Now that she's granted amnesty, and there's a possibility, I don't know, but just a possibility that Trump ordered to do that because there's been a big push to release these people. What are they guilty of? Protesting, free speech. What does she do now, Delcy Rodriguez, the president, with massive demonstrations? You see, now that people are released and she's portraying herself as a civil libertarian, then that means that they're now free to start protesting again, right? What is she going to do? So what is she going to do with 80% of the population starts flooding into the streets? If they do, now they still might be too scared. They might say, what? But you can see the dynamics taking place here. She's saying, I'm releasing people who were jailed because of protesting. It's a new day in Venezuela. Most likely, just in my opinion, it's on orders. Then people say, okay. Well, then that means we can go out and protest again. Well, that's what put them in jail in the first place. Dictators and illegitimate rulers do not like hundreds of thousands of people filling the streets demanding their ouster. And then what if Machado comes back and leads these demonstrations? What do they do with her? She's under this criminal indictment, which of course is bogus. But, if the U.S. is indicting their president of their country, what's to prevent Rodriguez and the narco-terrorist regime from indicting Machado? And so you can see the dynamics here. Very combustible. To me, this thing could explode at any minute. You just don't know what's going to happen or when it's going to happen. So they're using now this siege idea to get Cuba. Now there's this obsession with Cuba. It's been there on the part of the U.S. national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. They've been obsessed with Cuba since the Cuban Revolution that put the socialist-communist regime in there. And so notice the irony. You've got this anti-communist mindset that has guided the United States since, the end of World War II. That's what was used to justify the conversion of the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state in the first place. Total fundamental change in the governmental structure of the United States. That's how we got these totalitarian powers, the power to kill people and kill anyone. Now, they've exercised this power most recently, assassinating these people in the boats there in the Caribbean and in the Pacific near Venezuela and Colombia. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, this is horrifying. I mean, I'd be tempted to say it's legalized murder, but it's not, because it's not legal at all. None of these killings can be justified under any law at all. You can't justify it under the drug war, because the drug war is not a death penalty offense. Drug offenses are not drug penalty offenses. Even if a person's convicted, they can't give him the death penalty. The most they can just send him to jail. But they were killing these people, or have been killing people, presumably still doing so, over 100 people. This is incredible. And it's not, they say, oh, this is a war, this is a war. There's no war. You can't go to war against a cartel. It's like going to war against the mafia. Is that a real war? We're governed by the rules of war? Of course not. It's like a war on crime. And Maduro is over there in New York hoisting them on their own petard, because he's saying, well, if it's a war, which is what you're doing to justify the killing of these people in these boats, then I'm a prisoner of war. Oh, no, you're a criminal defendant. Drug offenses are a criminal offense, and they are a criminal offense. But they were assassinating these people. And we have this principle called innocent till proven guilty. That's the presumption in this country. So all these people are presumed innocent. They start out as innocent until they're proven guilty, and they could have just demanded their surrender, which they all would have done. I mean, when you're facing an aircraft carrier and a destroyer and whatever, these warships and drones and B-52s. I mean, there's no evidence that these boats were even armed, except with cocaine, maybe. We don't even know that. See, because they haven't been convicted of anything. They might not have been carrying drugs at all. Now, the Trump administration says, we have evidence. We have information. We can't give you that because of national security. But even if they have tape recordings, you don't know what's on those boats. It may be what they think are drugs. A lot of times, they get defrauded by the drug supplier, and it's, empty packages. But you don't just go kill people before convicting them. Or at the very least, you demand their surrender. And of course, they all would have surrendered. And so, people are outraged, of course, about the killing of the survivors. There were people who survived the initial attack on one of these boats, and they went back in and killed them. Okay, well, this is how a national security state operates. There is no conscience involved here. There's no remorse. And it extends to American citizens. You see, it's a power play. It's not just killing people over there. If those boat people were Americans, and they may well be, we don't know who was on those boats. It doesn't matter. They wield that authority. Trump can order the killing of anyone, and the Supreme Court has already made it clear we're not going to interfere. But it's as long as the military is involved. You see, but just because you get the military involved, that doesn't make it a wartime situation. It's just the military enforcing criminal statutes. It's the military operating in a police role. But now they're using this siege mentality to target the Cuban civilian population, because they've been obsessed. They've had this anti-communist crusade mentality that's never gone away. We thought it went away in 1989 when the Cold War came to an end, but it didn't. Not for the U.S. That was when NATO began moving eastward after falsely promising Russia that they would not do so in order to provoke Russia into attacking Ukraine. So now what started out is, hey, it's a new world. At the end of the Cold War, things could have been so different. Mutual harmonies between nations, free trade, and free travel between the countries. And it could have been a really much different world than what we have here. But the U.S. national security establishment said, no, we need those official enemies to exist. People might want to go back to a limited government republic. So that's when they provoke Russia into attacking Ukraine. And so you end up with this same anti-communist mindset that is now anti-Russia. Russia's a new official enemy, along with China. They hated the fact that China was making friends in Latin America. That's what this is all about. Empires hate rivals. They hate competitors. So when the U.S. was bogged down killing people and sacrificing soldiers for nothing in Afghanistan for 20 years, in Iraq, China was out making friends. Now, clearly it was a socialist way of making friends, giving them grants and loans, but it doesn't matter. China was making friends, and that infuriated the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA. So they needed to make China a new official enemy, which they did with Trump's trade war in his first time around. And that's what started all the animosity and sanctions against China, sanctions against Iran, and so forth. Well, the anti-communist mentality has never been lost with respect to Cuba. I mean, the Pentagon is still chafing over the CIA, the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the CIA proxy army got defeated by Castro's army. They were pressuring Kennedy to attack and invade and bomb Cuba throughout his administration, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which would have meant all-out nuclear war without any question whatsoever. Kennedy resisted that pressure, thank God. And then there's been the repeated assassination attempts. In fact, they always say that Cuba's a threat to U.S. national security. It's the exact opposite. The U.S. has always been the aggressor. This is what Martin Luther King was talking about, Jr., when he said that the U.S. government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he was speaking primarily of Vietnam, but clearly he was thinking of Cuba too, because the U.S. has always been the aggressor against Cuba and has never ceased. When the Cold War ended, they didn't lift that embargo. And so the embargo, like the sanctions of Venezuela, squeezes the Cuban people. They're the ones in the middle. And the idea was impoverish them along with Cuban socialism, really put the squeeze on them so that they'll revolt and put in another U.S. dictatorship, like Fulgencio Batista regime that preceded the Castro regime. So it's not that they want freedom that for the Cuban people, or they're concerned about Cuba's people's living under socialism and communism, because look at Venezuela. They don't care that people are living under that regime still. They don't care that people are not free to accumulate wealth and have a free market system. They don't care about that. Or that people can't go out and protest and demonstrate. They don't care. So they don't have any feelings in that area toward Cuba either. It's all because, in my opinion, they're chafing over the fact that the Castro army smashed the CIA's army at the Bay of Pigs, and that they've never taken orders from the U.S. empire. You see, if Castro had taken orders from the U.S. empire, everything would be different. How do we know that? Venezuela. Rodriguez is willing to take orders. Okay, then you're a socialist, communist, narco-terrorist regime. You get to stay in power. We'll work with you. And the same thing could happen with Cuba. But now they're stopping Venezuela from sending oil to Cuba. So they're desperate. I mean, people are on the verge of starvation. When I visited Cuba, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, they were already on the verge of starvation, but they are truly on the verge of starvation now. And the right wing is gleeful about this. Gleeful because, it means the Cuba regime might fall. Well, at what expense? I mean, there's no upward limit on the number of Cubans they're willing to kill or sacrifice here. It doesn't matter to them any more than the lives of those people in those boats matter to them, or the lives of Iraqi people. Remember when Madeleine Albright was asked by 60 Minutes, she was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it, worth regime change? And she said, yeah, it's worth it. And her mindset was the mindset of official Washington, along with a lot of the right wing and the statists and the interventionists. Why should they care about the lives of the Iraqi people? And why should they care about the lives of the Cuban people? It's all about control and power. And one of the biggest messages in all this is the destruction of American liberty. And Americans think, oh, well, no, Jacob, this is glorious. We're winning military battles. This is great for the military after Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam. This is a big picker-upper, the fact that they've defeated this boat army. It's like the Battle of Midway in World War II and stuff. No, it's not. This is a cowardly thing to take on a third-rate country and then boat people that there's no evidence they're even armed. This goes beyond the fight for freedom, the fight for a better way of life. And in fact, I'll conclude by letting you all know that I'm starting a new podcast series called The Evil Within. And I'm going to be talking about the evil within the federal government. Now, I know there's people that think, well, no, there's no evil in the world. And Well, I'm not one of them. I believe there is a great battle taking place between good and evil. And I won't be talking about evil people, how do you decide who's evil or not? I'm going to be talking about evil systems that have attached themselves to our federal governmental system. And that as long as this evil system or evil systems remain attached to the federal government, this country is going to be in a world of hurt. So, in other words, I'll be talking about not just freedom, the battle for freedom, not only the battle for higher standards of living and harmony and peace and prosperity, we'll be talking about the battle for good in this series. And of course, they bear a direct relationship to what's happening with respect to Venezuela, Cuba, and many other parts of the world. That's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again for your support of our work. We're very, very grateful. We're very, very honored. And I'll see you all next time.